You need good intelligence in wartime, right? You want at least some advanced knowledge of enemy plans and operations in order to best thwart them. Well, Korea is no different from any other war. But to gather intelligence, the UN forces have the Blue Boys. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, 8th Army Commander Matt Ridgway's new offensive, Operation Killer, began. But, largely thanks to the weather, it moved pretty slowly the last few days of the week. And Chinese Commander Peng Dehuai cornered Mao Zedong in his bedroom to try and tell him how badly the war is actually going for them lately. Even though Operation Killer is just plodding along, it is still moving, and by the end of February has mostly eliminated the enemy's recent gains. By March 1st, 9th Corps and 10th Corps hold positions in an arc like 8 kilometers north of Chipyong-ni, which goes along high ground overlooking Wonsan and Route 20 from the south, then to the hills just north of where Route 20 meets Route 60. That day, the U.S. 1st Marine Division clears Wonsan with little resistance, then advances 5 kilometers or so north of the town to the Arizona Line position. Further to the east, Yoo Jae-hung's ROK, South Korean, 3rd Corps, is also on the move. He sent 2 regiments from the Capital Division westward along Route 20 from the Gangneung area, moving across the front of his other 2 divisions so they can set up defenses above the road. But on the 3rd, their column gets hit by an ambush about 40 kilometers west of Gangneung near Soksari. It's a regiment of the KPA, North Korean, 2nd Division that hits them hard from both the north and the south. And the Capital Division takes around 1,000 casualties, 800 of them men missing, and returns whence they came. Operation Killer doesn't seem like it's really going to achieve its goal, which is destroying all enemy forces below what they call the Arizona Line. We saw last week that the weather prevented any rapid advance, and the Chinese and North Koreans had a 3-day head start withdrawing northward. I could be wrong, but Matt Ridgway is in fact already planning another operation to finish the job. This is a bit different though. Yes, the primary purpose of Operation Ripper will be to destroy enemy forces and sabotage their attempts to organize an offensive of their own. And yes, the main effort will again be in the center. But this time, all 8th Army units on the front will be involved. And it will have a second objective of outflanking Seoul and the ground north of the capital up to the Imjin River. We've seen that Ridgway doesn't particularly care for taking symbolic prizes like Seoul, but UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur does. So to try and make them both happy, there will not be a direct assault across the Han River on Seoul, which would likely cause a lot of casualties, but a flanking attack on the city and the ground north of it from the east, or by just showing such a large threat, the enemy withdraws voluntarily. The Ripper plan comes out on March 1st. But Ridgway does not yet set a date. See, the forward areas have something of a supply shortage in terms of gas, food, and ammunition. This is partly by design, though. They consciously did not maintain forward stockpiles of things during the recent enemy attacks so as to not be forced to leave behind or destroy supplies. Also, the destruction of bridges and roads and rail lines by the heavy rains and melting ice prevented resupply last week. So, Ridgway is not setting a kickoff date until he has a 5-day level of supplies at all points along the line. On the 1st, he estimates it should take around 5 days to get that fixed. He also, though, has plans to cancel Ripper if during this resupplying phase they get any clear evidence that the enemy is about to attack. Again, Ridgway thinks taking or losing ground is immaterial. What counts is causing maximum casualties while maintaining his own units intact. So what are the Chinese and the North Koreans up to? Well, 8th Army G2, that's Intelligence Chief James Tarkenton, says the forces opposite 9th and 10th Corps are taking positions just above the Arizona line, and that as of the 1st, there are 6 Chinese armies and 4 North Korean corps lined up between Seoul and the Taebaek Mountains. But he has reports that 2 Chinese armies have moved south from around Hungnam to a central assembly point north of Chonchon, so that makes 3 reserve armies he counts that could be useful for enemy offensive operations. To add substance to this possibility, agents recently returned from behind enemy lines brought back reports that the enemy high command at one time had planned to open an offensive on the 1st of March, then had postponed the opening date to the 15th. During interrogation, recently taken prisoners of war partially substantiated the agent reports by stating that their forces were preparing to launch an offensive in the 8th Army's Central Zone early in March. To further back that up, there are reports that KPA 6 Corps, who withdrew into Manchuria last fall, are now back in Korea and heading towards the front in the west. At least some elements of this corps are approaching the 38th parallel northwest of Seoul, which is close enough to take part in an offensive. Tarkington concludes from all of this that though the Chinese and North Koreans are planning an offensive, it's not imminent because most of their reserves are too far away for immediate employment. Ridgway also launches a distraction campaign, an amphibious demonstration in the Yellow Sea. This will hopefully fix down enemy reserves since they'll wonder where the next blow will fall. Minesweepers are moving up and down the western coast and into the Taedong estuary since Chinanpo. A cruiser and some destroyers bomb what could be landing sites. Troop and cargo ships leave Incheon and head north, only to later reverse their course. And as we've seen, on the east coast, Wonsan has been blockaded for 2 weeks now, and South Korean forces occupied an island in the bay there. So that could be an amphibious target too, right? Ridgway proposes to UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur that the departure of 2 National Guard units about to leave the States for Japan should be publicized with a deception campaign that they're heading over for amphibious operations in Korea. But this doesn't happen. Well, the week ends without Ridgway's 5-day of supply level being fully stocked, so we still do not know the launch date for Operation Ripper. I've talked a bit lately about intelligence, what there is or the lack thereof. Most information Ridgway has does come from Korean agents that are infiltrated behind enemy lines. Now, Tarkington is G2 of 8th Army, but it is Jim Polk who is G2 of Ned Almond's 10th Corps, and several sources call him the outstanding collector of intel from such agents. These are the Blue Boys, who were sent into the north. There was a 2-way traffic of agents across no man's land. Polk and his officers managed to turn many captured North Korean spies who became double agents. Some even became quadruple agents, working for several United Nations countries and receiving pay from all. As the Blue Boy network expanded, it was run from headquarters 10th Corps by one Major Jurgensen, whose parents had been missionaries in Korea and who himself spoke fluent Korean. One of Polk's top informants is actually a captured Chinese medical officer. He had been part of Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese Nationalist Army, but was press-ganged into Mao's People's Liberation Army, which was always very short of trained medical personnel. That is just one problem the Chinese are trying to deal with at the moment. By March 1951, the CCF, Chinese Communist Forces, had been halted, hurt, and forced back. It was apparent it would soon be forced completely out of the Taehan-Minkook. The lines would then stand where they had in June 1950 and where they had stood in October. But this time, there was no exaltation in Washington, no confidence in cheap victory. With each of its allies screaming for an end to the war, now deeply aware of the dangers in humbling China, Washington was willing to negotiate. In February, the New York Times had a headline, "U.S. to seek peace, spokesmen say, a reversal of policy." And in the article, sources who could not be named but who worked in the government say that the policy of last fall, of defeating the aggressors, is no longer the case. You can see this also in President Harry Truman's long telegram to Douglas MacArthur in mid-January. He says that, yes, the U.S. must continue to defend South Korea, but it is also very busy with consolidating Europe. Europe is still the big prize, and the USSR the greatest potential active enemy. So doing anything that was good for the Americans in Korea, but detrimental to U.S. strength or support in Europe, was out of bounds. Starting an actual official war with China would very likely rupture NATO, and Truman did not want that to happen. Something you have to consider here. This policy is in part dictated by the weakness of the West. I mean, the U.S. has the bomb, but it doesn't have the army. There really isn't any real barrier in Europe that could prevent it being overrun by the Soviet Red Army. Truman's not going to be able to relax until such a barrier can be built, and that takes NATO. So Washington is not going to favor Asia over Europe for the time being. MacArthur might strongly disagree, but he sure has to hear the message. Okay, there was no open breach between Truman and MacArthur at the time. But then, February 13th, MacArthur condemned any Washington readiness to accept a stalemate as wholly unrealistic and illusory. In February 1951, a peculiar minuet occurred between the State and Defense Departments on the subject of Korea. Neither wished to assume formal responsibility for accepting a stalemate. While the Pentagon insisted on political guidance, State demanded an estimate of military capabilities on which to form a judgment. Neither would make definite recommendations in its own fields without the conclusions of the other. To the Joint Chiefs, there are sound military reasons for stopping at the parallel, but the Pentagon insists any decision wait until MacArthur has reached the main line of enemy resistance, and the Chinese should not have any sort of safe haven from Ridgway's war of attrition. There is, though, pretty clear evidence that people are just evading responsibility. With the great debate still in progress, the Pentagon did not wish to assume responsibility for shackling MacArthur with further restrictions, disrupting the uneasy calm between Washington and Tokyo. As Rusk noted on the 20th of February, while the JCS opposed a major crossing of the parallel, they were unsure of how to handle the situation with MacArthur. That was last month. But now, in early March, State and Defense are reaching consensus on what to do at the parallel and beyond. I will get into that later in March when it is announced, but on February 27th, the Joint Chiefs, acting on MacArthur's wishes, do recommend to the Secretary of Defense that MacArthur's directive from last September not be changed, and he be allowed to deploy his forces either side of the parallel as best to provide for their security. However, MacArthur's request to attack the Yalu River power stations is denied. He is to leave them alone because of possible, or likely, repercussions should the power supply to Vladivostok or other Soviet towns be cut off. You know, MacArthur is not interested in Europe. He's interested in his own command, Japan and Korea. But Truman is aware that a minor incident in, say, Indochina, Yugoslavia, or Berlin could cause the Soviets to intervene in the East. So when MacArthur suggests things like bombing Chinese cities, Truman thought the general was overlooking what would happen after the bombs dropped. Then the first calls would go out for the UN to bomb the Soviet port of Vladivostok and the Trans-Siberian Railroad because of all the material the Russians would send in by train. Truman doubted very much that MacArthur considered the way this would escalate the war, ultimately placing Japanese cities at risk from Russian countermoves. Well, none of those bombs fall this week, as it turns out, and here I shall end my coverage of the week, with Operation Killer plodding forward, Operation Ripper being planned but with no definite start date, and MacArthur not really interested in Truman's big picture perspective. Oh, and the 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry has arrived and joined the 27th Commonwealth Brigade. This actually happened last week. Brigade Commander Basil Coat has returned from Hong Kong, and his 4 battalions are in the mountains northwest of Wonsan, with the ROK 6 on their right and the U.S. 1st Cavalry on their left. Both MacArthur's standing and his pride have been damaged lately. None other than Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, will later write the following about MacArthur in these days. It's quoted in David Halberstam. It's pretty long and pretty harsh stuff for one American general to write of another. MacArthur's reaction arose, I feel certain, at least in part from the fact that his legendary military pride had been hurt. The Red Chinese had made a fool of the infallible military genius. By then, it must have been clear to him that his failure to send 10th Corps in pursuit of the North Korean army after Incheon, and to split his forces and send 10th Corps to Wonsan was an error of grave magnitude. Furthermore, the Chinese had made a mockery of his intelligence estimates, of his vainglorious boasts that his all-out air assault, including bombing the Korean ends of the Yalu bridges, would make Northwest Korea a desert, and his assertion that our men would advance to the Yalu and be home by Christmas. The only possible means left to MacArthur to regain his lost pride and military reputation was now to inflict an overwhelming defeat on those Red Chinese generals who had made a fool of him. In order to do this, he was perfectly willing to propel us into an all-out war with Red China and possibly with the Soviet Union, igniting World War III and a nuclear holocaust. Wow. Well, I've covered both World War I and World War II from start to finish. So if World War III starts anytime in the 1950s, I'll likely be here to cover that too. Right now, all of your Time Ghost hosts are busy covering stuff post-World War II and our War to War series on the Time Ghost History channel. You should very much head over and check that out. It'll be up here soon enough. All of our series are produced thanks to the sterling efforts of the Time Ghost Army. That is what allows all of this. You too can be part of this adventure by joining the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Center 68 is the Army Member of the Week. These are the newest officers. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.